a trend within Bible translations to try to offset any potential misunderstanding, confusion when reading the New Testament whenever the phrase "the Jews" appears in the original Greek. And the first version to do that, the translation that I had highlighted, was called the Contemporary English Version, which was released in 1995. And I had shown you a couple examples. Let's see if I go back. Yeah. So I had this comparison between the King James Version and the Contemporary English Version. You can see this, I think this is the last slide in the series of comparison slides, where you can see what the Contemporary English Version and these other versions that do to offset the potential misunderstanding the phrase "the Jews." And here in the CEV, we have the disciples who were afraid of the Jewish leaders instead of the disciples who were afraid of the Jews. So we had asked the question, what do you all think of that? There was a lot of pushback that that was not a good thing. And I had attempted to make the argument to the contrary, regardless of whether that's my position or not. So we tried to have that type of discussion. Then I emphasized why we're even having that type of need or discussion as far as trying to add clarification to the Bible text. And I had given this example from the late 19th century, a German named Willibald Beischlag, who had commented in his New Testament Theology, 2 volumes, and he had carelessly, and just referring to John 8, described the Jews. You'll see in the highlighted section, the Jews are no children of Abraham because they do not the works of Abraham. They are not the children of God, but of the devil, because lying and murder is their nature. Now, that was not necessary, some 19 centuries after the fact. You could be a lot more clear. Instead, the way he phrases it makes it sound like the entire race of Jews are children of the devil. And this is the reason why, come the 20th century, there's this awareness and consideration for how the term had been used over the previous generations among Christians, and clearly a handful of Bible translators, and it seems to be the trend, are trying to avoid this type of, I would call, sloppy reference to the text. Jesus was, if you go to John 8, was actually talking to the Pharisees when there's a reference to the Jews. So anyway, that was primarily what we were looking at last week. And I think I was closing on the topic of if we go back into the first century, and this, the broader discussion, we're talking about the terms anti-Semitism, anti-Judaism, and trying to find out if there's a way to explain what we find in the book of John, why half the references to the Jews are always a negative or antagonistic. And the term anti-Judaism had been introduced, hoping to explain that, and that really doesn't work either. So I want to still work on anti-Judaism, even though it doesn't help us with what we find in the Gospel of John or in Luke. I still think anti-Judaism is something we need to look at a little bit more closely and see what happens over time after we leave the first century. So I had asked the question back in the first century, would there be any groups that would be identified as being or classified as being anti-Judaism outside the Christian community? And I think Jacob, I don't think Jacob's here this week, but he had pointed out that the Romans themselves could be classified as anti-Judaism. But at the same time, they're not all that concerned about what the Jews do, as long as they pay their taxes and obey the governors that the Romans put in place. If the Jews want to have their own calendar and their own dietary restrictions and their own place of worship. I mean, that's fine. The Romans already have their pantheon of gods. They have Olympus, they have Plato. The Jews can go off, do what they want to. Anti-Judaism really becomes a thing when we have Christianity come onto the scene, because now we have two groups who are saying, I have the truth, and they're all using the same sources. They're using the same Old Testament, they're using the same prophets, using the same scriptures. They're now calling it like a family feud. The Romans are like, they're outside. They don't care what happens within Judaism. So anti-Judaism really is a term that would begin to apply to the Christians, because the Christians are opposed to what the Jewish rabbis or the Pharisees at the time would have been emphasizing as the necessary requirements for righteousness. So anti-Judaism really comes into play when we get into the first century conflict between the Christians and the Jewish leaders, which you can see I'm even tempted to say the Jews. So I think that's where we left off last week. Now this controversy, this conflict within a family feud, you could say it's a family feud except for one thing. Most families don't end up killing each other or members in the family just because you don't agree on certain things. We see very early on in the book of Acts how things turned deadly with the stoning of Stephen. And then that wasn't where it stopped. It continued. James, the brother of John, was executed. We remember Saul of Tarsus was dragging off the Jewish Christians at that time, arresting them and dragging them off to the Sanhedrin. I'm not actually sure what happened to those individuals when they were dragged off to the Sanhedrin, but nonetheless, they were. So you can see as time progresses, going to the book of Acts and going into the middle of the first century, the level of animosity is steadily increasing between the Jewish leaders and this new sect, which became known as Christianity. And even after Paul's conversion, what did the Jewish leaders want to do to Paul? They wanted to have Paul killed. So this family feud, you could say it's a family feud, but it's a deadly family feud. This is leading to bloodshed. So this is more than just a little squabble over various questions of the Jewish religion. However, if you stand back from the Roman perspective, it does seem like just a bunch of arguments over questions. And this passage from the book of Acts, chapter 23, will give you the perspective from the Roman side. And this reads, Claudius Lysias unto the most excellent governor Felix sendeth greeting. This man Paul was taken of the Jews and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him. Again, as an example, taken of the Jews. So it's as if the entire race of Jews had done this, when in fact it was a very select group, clearly the religious leaders. Nonetheless, and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. And when I would have known the cause whereof he was accused, whereof they accused him, I brought him forth into their council, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or bonds. So again, you have the element of death in this, the threat of death on Paul. But from the Roman perspective, it's just a bunch of questions about their law. It's not a big deal to the Romans. This is kind of a silly argument as far as the Roman perspective. And then this slide here, 2 chapters later, you can see the same thing going on. I'll jump down to verse 18. When the accuser stood up, of course this would be the Jewish leaders, they brought no charge in his case such evils as I suppose, but they had certain points of dispute with him about their own superstition and about one Jesus who was dead, but whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate these questions, I asked whether he wished to go to Jerusalem and be tried there regarding them. So, again, it's not a crime against either Roman society or Roman law. This is all an internal argument within Judaism itself. So this is where we begin to see anti-Judaism become a question.
I think you're leaving out an important point. That is, when you say anti-Judaism, you don't read of Paul or anybody advocating violence towards the Jews. It's always the other way around. The Jews advocated violence towards the Christians. The violence toward the Jews came centuries later.
Mm-hmm. Right. So the family feud would be like a one-way family feud, is your point, that only one side one side is using violence in order to resolve the dispute. That's what your point is. Yeah, that's right. So the Christians are willingly going to their deaths or being dragged before the Sanhedrin, just like Jesus, who is their leader and their example. So that's is an important point. Thank you, Randy. All right, so you can see early on Christianity was seen as a little more than a dispute over certain points of Jewish faith. It's hard to make the case then that anti-Judaism existed prior to, well, maybe you might say the Greeks' Antiochus Epiphanes, when he tried to set up an idol, I think to Zeus or to one of the Greek deities on the temple grounds. But it really is, as time progresses, do we see a open conflict, and the chasm starts to grow greater and greater as time passes. So I think I've mentioned in the past that Christadelphians, they could be described as being anti-Judaism. We are not anti-Semitic. We have no hatred toward the Jewish people due to race. Or any opposition to the Jewish people would be that their faith simply is detrimental to obtaining eternal life. It's not that the Christadelphians are opposed to the Jews keeping the Sabbath, or the Jews commemorating the Passover, or Jews circumcising their sons, or Jew avoiding pork. If they wish to do that, that's fine. We have no problem with that. Our called bone of contention, our anti-Judaism, only comes into play because we believe that these things do not make a person righteous before God, and will not bring the practitioner of those things eternal life. So in that sense, we're anti-Judaism. And I think it is important to draw a distinction between those, having a term that would apply to that situation. We are not anti-Semitic, but we would be anti-Judaism. Now, by the end of the first century, this division has become visible, and definitely you have a separation almost where you have very few Jews, if any, accepting Christianity. And from that point onward, as we go into the second century, we see a very clear struggle between you can call them two ways of life. And I think you could look in Galatians chapter 4, and you can see Paul illustrating the struggle, and he uses an allegory. And this is Galatians chapter 4. And the section here, starting in verse 21, says, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, or under law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, one by a slave and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, the son of the free woman through promise." So the son of the slave was Ishmael. And the son of the free woman, the son of promise, was Isaac, right? So Paul's bringing these two people, these two sons forward, but then he goes on and tries to make an allegory out of this. So he continues in verse 24, now this is an allegory. These women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. So what's Paul doing here? What Paul is doing is he's presenting an allegory. And then the question is, what is an allegory? Anyone want to tell us what an allegory is? Okay. It gets confused. Oh, you want to take a stab at it? Jason?
I would define it very closely to a parable or a fable, like Aesop's fable. It is an incident that then points to a larger picture or a larger principle.
I guess in some sense, you're using it like a parable. Yeah, I guess in some sense it's very close to a parable.
What I teach my kids for allegory is that it's usually used with animals, but not always. Very much like a fable in that it has a deeper meaning than what's on the surface,
Right.
like an extended metaphor.
But you could say a parable has the same thing. A parable has a deeper significance than what you see on the surface. So allegory actually comes from the Greek, two words, allos, meaning another, and agoria, which means to speak. So if you were to put that together, you'd have another way to speak, or speaking in another way. And an allegory, at least how I found it defined, was something that is spoken that is representative of something else. So in Paul's example here, he's using Mount Sinai and Jerusalem to represent something else, that is slavery. And he's representing Jerusalem from above, the heavenly Jerusalem, as our faith. Paul describes the mountain Jerusalem, or as long as like two. You could say he's got two mountains. He's got Mount Sinai, but then Jerusalem, of course, is on Mount Zion, and both of them he's describing as in slavery. And then he's comparing, I guess, the highest mountain in heaven, which will one day come to earth as the New Jerusalem. So this is an allegory, a spoken message where symbols. Walter, your hands up.
So I guess if we go way back to high school, y'all may remember that place in your English class. I remember an allegory being specifically either a story, a poem, or a picture. Within that context, there's a hidden meaning that usually addresses either something that's moral or political. And essentially that's what this does. There's a moral picture hiding behind here if we look at the comparison of the two women.
Right. Okay, so now I want to turn our attention away from Mount Sinai and Jerusalem, and oddly enough, I want to turn our attention to Europe. Specifically, I want to look at France, the country of France. So what I want to graphically share with you is essentially another allegory. This allegory involves sculpture. This allegory involves architecture. And I'm doing this because I want to visually illustrate this idea of a struggle going on between these two ways of life. And just like Paul did, he used two women. I'm going to use two women likewise. And you'll see all this will tie back to our discussion on anti-Judaism. So I'm going to take you to France. Okay, and I'm going to take you to the city of Strasbourg. And I've got Strasbourg there, pretty much standing out in the northeast corner of France, almost on the border of Germany. And I want to take you to the heart of the city of Strasbourg. And you could say this cathedral is the heart of Strasbourg, and it's conveniently known as Strasbourg Cathedral. If you want to get really technical, it's the Cathedral of Our Lady of Strasbourg. And with a name like that, Our Lady, you can pretty well guess that this is a Catholic cathedral. And it was dedicated to the Virgin Mary. It was built in the 14th century, and it's quite a magnificent building. It's a really big church, it's beautiful. But if you head over to the south side of the cathedral, you'll see this entranceway. I'm going to zoom in closer and look at these figures standing on each side of these doors. You can call this a portal. And there's three figures here I've isolated. Now, I've been told that the figure in the center between the two doors is supposed to be King Solomon. I'm not quite sure there's any way to verify that, but that's what I came up with. I think if I were looking at this, I'd probably, if you knew who the two figures on the sides are, two women, you might say this would make more sense if it was Jesus, but my research says that the figure in the center is King Solomon. But having said that, my focus, or what I'm focused on, are the two female figures, one on the left and one on the right. And what you see here at Strasbourg, it's not unique to the Strasbourg Cathedral. You will find this, what I'm about to share with you, this allegory and this type of artwork. You'll find this in many Catholic cathedrals. And I picked this example because it was the best one I could find as far as getting illustrations and high-res photographs. All right, so here's another example from a different cathedral. You'll see a little bit more grainy. You can kind of see like why I chose Strasbourg. But if you look closely, I paired them off. There's things that are similar to both pairs. The ones in the middle, by the way, are from Notre Dame Cathedral, also in France. Can you pick up what is common between these figures? And I'll just mention to you in advance that these are not Bible characters. This is not, Ruth and Mary. These are supposed to be representative women. And what can you pick up that are common between these women? Jason, Walter?
I won't get them all, but each of the figures holds something in their hand that's to be presented to us. The two on the right I actually recognize as being symbolic of justice, and perhaps that's the law, and the one in the left hand, and maybe the right one also has it. As for the other two, I'm not as familiar with them. I'm sure you'll tell me and I'll remember what they are.
Okay.
But each one's holding something that has some significance. The one on the left
you're
has
talking about this here, and that would be matched with this. So these two figures are holding something in their, one is the left hand and the other is the right hand. They're both what? Blindfold. Okay, so the ones over here, they have a blindfold.
Both have something applied to their head, right? One is a blindfold, the other is a crown.
You mentioned a crown. So we have on the left side here, they're wearing a crown, or yeah, they are. Now what you see them holding here, this is a cup, a goblet. Whoops. And I don't think that, it doesn't look like a goblet to me. Now you see the staff here, they have a cross on the top. Excuse me. And let me see if I can get you. All right, so here's another pair. So here you do see the goblet repeated on this one. Again, you have the staff with the cross on the top, you have the crown. Over here, there's a blindfold, and you barely make out, I think here you have this same thing being held. So what are we seeing here? So it's 3 different cathedrals, and we're seeing the same type of statues or symbols here. So what you see, they actually have a name. Each of the women, the representative women, have a name. The one or ones on the left side here on the screen is ecclesia, and it should be a term we're all familiar with, ecclesia. What does ecclesia mean? It's, called out or an assembly. The figure on the right-hand side has a name. She or they are called synagoga. And synagoga means synagogue, which interestingly is supposed to be the equivalent of what an ecclesia is, only Christians use the term ecclesia, and synagoga or synagogue is usually a term you find within Judaism. Okay, so art. I'm spending some time here showing you art, and I love art. Art communicates to us in a very powerful way. It can communicate worldviews. It can even instruct us in theology, which is the reason why I have it here this morning. If you look at art, you sometimes can say that art is trying to tell us a story. If you look at a painting, historically, maybe not so much these days, you would find in art, whether they be statues, paintings, stained glass windows, stories are being told through art very frequently. And this is a way that you can communicate to illiterate people. You don't need to be able to read in order to understand stories that can be told by looking at art. So what are the stories behind these 2 figures? Actually, let me give you another example here. Okay, so there's the ecclesia and synagoga. All right, so I want to show a different type of art. I'm a little bit ahead of myself. So here we have stained glass, and this is very common. It's a common way to express a story, and you find this this is why you find so much stained glass in churches. You can just look up and you can say there's Isaac and Abraham at Mount Moriah, which is what this is supposed to be. You don't need to have a Bible in front of you. You don't need to be able to read from Genesis. You can just look at that and say Isaac's on an altar about to be sacrificed. There by Abraham, his dad, an angel appears and prevents Abraham, and the angel points to the ram in the thicket. So you don't even need a Bible. You can keep your Bible at home. You can tell stories about the Bible through pictures. This is how you can conceptualize the biblical world and the Bible when you can't read. Now, art can also communicate theology. And you could say there's some theology here. The theology view that Abraham obeyed God. And it also points to the sacrifice ultimately that Jesus would lay down his life as a sacrifice to God in obedience to God. So you can bring some theology, obviously, out of art, especially if it's art in a cathedral. So let's go back to our sculptures here. Synagoga and ecclesia. Now, what they represent, it shouldn't be too hard now. I'm giving you the names of the types of symbols of sculpture here. The ecclesia symbol is supposed to represent the church. And synagoga is supposed to represent Judaism. And maybe you can now see why I'm bringing this in our conversation of anti-Judaism. And you'll see where this goes here pretty quickly. So, The figure on the left, she looks pretty confident. And she's got this strong gaze. She's got her head up. She looks victorious. She's standing strong. Her shoulders are not hunched down. But on the right, synagoga, how's her head? Is it looking straight on? Is it fixed, confident gaze? It's always looking downward. She's looking down. Oops. Back up here. Why is that? And one has a crown and the other doesn't. One has a fancy drinking goblet, which you could say represents prosperity. And the one in the middle here, you may not be able to see too well, but right there, to me that looks like a money bag. And if that's true, then it would indicate prosperity. And here, I've blown into it. So you all have another idea. I think, to me, that represents prosperity. A little money bag around your waist before women had purses. Okay, so here we have synagoga, and Rebecca, you had mentioned that she's wearing a blindfold, but you'll notice one of these is more than just a blindfold that's covering her eyes. What is covering the eyes of synagoga on the left? It's a snake, it's a serpent. Not only are you just saying that you're blind, or the symbol representing the synagogue is blind, but you're some way implying it's due to this symbol of sin and evil, which often is how the serpent's represented in the Bible. In their book, yeah, and it could be, in our theology it wouldn't work, but yes, we're talking about the Catholic Church, of course. Now, if we go back, remember the dude in the middle, whether it's Jesus or King Solomon. Let's say it's King Solomon, okay? What does King Solomon often represent? Did I hear wisdom? Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
So let's say
divining
King
rightly.
Solomon represents wisdom. What does it mean when you have the church, ecclesia, looking toward the center, toward wisdom, and synagoga is actually turning away her head from wisdom? What is this signifying about Judaism? Not very good thing. It's one bad thing after another.
Below, if this is King Solomon, there's another image of judgment. And it looks like it could be of the two mothers.
Right.
So also I look at that as a symbol of judgment, and hopefully I'm not giving anything away in your class.
Right. Where might the Christians have come up with this idea of associating a blindfold with Judaism? Ring any bells with anybody? Randy?
Yeah.
Yeah, do you know a passage?
I don't have a passage, but
Yeah, it is from Paul. It's from the New Testament. It's from 2 Corinthians 13. Let's see if I've got... Yeah, actually, I do have it. So I think this is the passage you're referring to. Since we have such a hope, we are very bold, not like Moses, who put a veil over his face so that the Israelites might not see the end of the fading splendor. But their minds were hardened, for to this day, when they read the Old Covenant, that same veil remains unlifted, because only through Christ is it taken away. Yes, to this very day, whenever Moses is read, a veil lays over their mind. But when a man turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. Okay? So there's a veil in the form of a serpent. Jason?
Matthew 23:24 also has Jesus calling the religious leaders blind guides.
Right. Okay, now, I don't think anyone called this out, but what was being held in the hand of the synagogue are the tablets that supposedly represent, the laws that God gave to Moses and hence to the Jewish people.
Yeah, Philip, if you go back to that very first one, it looked like it had the Ten Commandments in her hand.
Yeah, that's what I was.
Not that one, it was the other one you showed. No, where was it? It looked like, yeah, there.
Yeah, well, then
Notice,
all these.
well, what I wanted to say is the posture of the two, they got a cup in their hand and it's held up confidently. If you notice both of them.
Yeah, it's being held down, and in fact, it's almost like she's trying to conceal it.
Yeah,
like the
or
one
it's
over on the far right, like she's got it behind her back.
It's not as respectful of a thing to hold the Ten Commandments down like that.
Yeah, many times when you see Moses with the Ten Commandments, he's like holding it up. So yeah, it's like they're trying to depict the synagogue or the Jews, the Jewish religion, in this very negative manner. And oops, going too fast here. No one called out, and I didn't even mention it, I failed to. There's a staff, this is synagogue, both two are synagogue. She's got this staff, and the staff is broken in multiple pieces. And often the staff is like a symbol of power or scepter, or even a spear. If it's a spear, then the spear is broken. So you see this with synagogue. You can see a little bit better up here, where the spear is clearly broken, and here's the spearhead. Okay, so it's like, here's a drawing. And if you want to use a spear as one's strength, let's say military prowess, it's been broken. So she's lost her strength.
Hey, Phil?
Yeah.
Just one more thing with the Solomon statue. He has a sword drawn in his lap.
Right.
And you got these two women to discern which was the right mother. If it's an allegory, that's